Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, where we break down chess games to help you improve your play and have some fun along the way. Today, we're diving into a fascinating battle between OngoleBull and opponent, featuring what looks like a classic Italian game setup, but with some subtle twists that really shape the flow of the opening. So, buckle up, and let's get right into it. White kicks things off with e4, staking a claim in the center and opening lines for the bishop and queen. This is textbook opening play, aiming for quick development and central control. Black responds symmetrically with e5, matching White's central presence and keeping the position balanced. White develops the knight to f3, attacking the e5 pawn and preparing to castle kingside. This move also helps White fight for control over the d4 square. Black mirrors with knight c6, defending the e5 pawn and developing a piece toward the center. Both sides are following classical principles here: develop pieces, control the center, and prepare to castle. White brings out the bishop to c4, targeting the vulnerable f7 square, the weakest point in Black's camp early on. This is a key idea in the Italian game, aiming for quick pressure on Black's kingside. Black responds with bishop c5, also aiming at the f2 pawn, mirroring White's strategy. This symmetrical setup often leads to rich tactical and strategic battles. White develops the knight to c3, supporting the center and preparing to reinforce control over d5 and e4 squares. Black develops the knight to f6, attacking the e4 pawn and preparing to castle kingside. Both sides are smoothly completing development and fighting for central dominance. White plays d3, a solid move that supports the e4 pawn and opens a diagonal for the dark-squared bishop. It's a bit more restrained than d4 but keeps the center flexible. Black replies with d6, reinforcing the e5 pawn and solidifying the center. This move also prepares for potential bishop g4 or bishop e6 ideas. Up to this point, the position is very balanced, and both players have followed sound opening principles. White plays h3. This move is a prophylactic idea, preventing Black's bishop or knight from pinning the knight on f3 or jumping to g4. It's a useful waiting move, but it does slightly slow down White's development since it doesn't contribute directly to center control or piece activity. Black responds with a6, which is a flexible move. It prepares b5 to gain space on the queenside and can also prevent White's pieces from landing on b5. This is a common thematic idea in many e4-e5 openings to expand on the flank. White develops the bishop to g5, pinning Black's knight on f6. This is a key strategic idea. Pinning knights that defend the center can create tension and potential weaknesses. Black challenges the bishop immediately with h6, questioning White's bishop and asking whether it wants to exchange or retreat. This is a typical reaction to pins, aiming to relieve pressure. White retreats the bishop to h4, maintaining the pin and keeping tension in the position. This move shows White's intention to keep Black's knight tied down, which can be a useful strategic lever. Black pushes b5, gaining space on the queenside and threatening to kick White's bishop on c4. This is an active move, showing Black's intent to seize the initiative on the flank. White moves the bishop to d5, centralizing it and putting pressure on Black's knight on c6 and the potentially weak pawn on d6. This is a strong positional idea, increasing White's influence in the center. Black plays queen d7 here, connecting the rooks and preparing to castle queenside. However, this is a critical moment because the engine suggests that bishop d7 would have been a better move. Why? Because bishop d7 would challenge White's bishop on d5 directly and support the knight on c6, helping Black maintain solid control over the center and queenside. Queen d7 is a bit slower and allows White to maintain pressure. White captures on f6 with bishop takes f6. This is a very important moment. White exchanges the bishop for the knight, which doubles Black's pawns after g takes f6, but also opens the g-file for Black's rook. The evaluation shows White gaining a significant advantage here, but the position remains complex. Black recaptures with g takes f6, accepting the doubled pawns but gaining open lines and dynamic chances. This is a classic trade-off, structural weakness for activity. Black's plan will likely involve using the open g-file and the bishop pair to generate counterplay. White plays a3. This is a useful waiting move, preventing black's pieces from landing on b4 and preparing to expand on the queenside if needed. It's subtle but helps white maintain control over key squares. Black develops the bishop to b7, placing it on the long diagonal where it eyes the center and white's kingside. This bishop becomes a powerful piece in open positions, especially targeting e4 and potentially h1a8 diagonal. White maneuvers the knight to h4, aiming to challenge black's kingside structure and possibly target the weakened f5 or g6 squares. This is a thematic idea when black's pawn structure is compromised on the kingside. Black castles queenside, bringing the king to safety and connecting the rooks. This move also signals black's intention to launch a pawn storm on the kingside, leveraging the open g-file and the semi-open h-file for an attack. White plays knight f5 here, moving the knight aggressively into black's territory. This knight jump is aimed at putting pressure on black's kingside, especially targeting the d6 pawn and potentially eyeing the g7 square. However, this move misses a stronger alternative: bishop takes c6. Why is bishop takes c6 better? By capturing on c6, white would double black's pawns and weaken black's queenside pawn structure, creating long-term weaknesses to target. Plus, it would remove a key defender of the center and open lines for white's rooks. Instead, knight f5 is a bit more tactical and immediate but doesn't capitalize on black's structural weaknesses. The key idea here is that sometimes trading off a strong defender or creating pawn weaknesses can be more valuable than immediate piece activity. Black responds with knight e7, retreating the knight to a more defensive post. This move aims to challenge white's knight on f5 and prepare to reroute the knight to better squares. However, engine analysis suggests knight d4 would have been stronger. Knight d4 is a more active and ambitious move because it centralizes the knight, attacks white's bishop on d5, and puts pressure on white's queenside pawns. This would force white to make a decision about the bishop and could help black seize the initiative. So here, black's knight e7 is solid but a bit passive, missing an opportunity to challenge white's control of the center more directly. White captures on e7 with knight takes e7 check, delivering a check and winning a knight. This is a good tactical shot that forces black's king or queen to recapture and disrupts black's coordination. Black recaptures with queen takes e7, keeping the king safer but losing the knight. Material is balanced, but white's knight activity and central pressure remain strong. White plays bishop takes b7 check, capturing black's bishop and checking the king. This is a sharp move that wins material and forces black's king to move, losing the right to castle. Black captures back with king takes b7, accepting the loss of castling rights but maintaining material balance. This move also opens the a8-h1 diagonal for white's rook and queen to potentially exploit. White's knight jumps to d5. This is a strong centralizing move, putting pressure on black's queen and controlling key squares. The knight on d5 is a classic outpost, especially effective because it's supported by pawns and pieces, and black has no easy way to dislodge it without concessions. Black responds with queen e6, centralizing the queen and defending critical squares. This move also eyes the knight on d5 and prepares to coordinate with other pieces for defense or counterattack. White pushes b4 next. This move aims to challenge black's bishop on c5 and gain queenside space. However, it's a slight misstep compared to the stronger queen f3, which would have kept more pressure on black's king and coordinated better with white's pieces. The key idea here is that in positions with an exposed king, piece activity and coordination often trump pawn advances that don't directly contribute to attack or defense. Black retreats the bishop to a7, maintaining pressure along the diagonal and keeping the bishop safe. This move also keeps an eye on white's queenside pawns and supports potential pawn breaks. White pushes a4, trying to solidify control on the queenside and prevent black's pawn advances. This is a logical follow-up to b4, aiming to restrict black's counterplay. Black plays c6, reinforcing the center and preparing to challenge white's knight on d5. This is a thematic pawn break that aims to undermine white's strong knight and open lines for black's pieces. White retreats the knight to e3, repositioning it to support central and kingside squares. This move also prepares to contest the d5 and f5 squares and keeps options open for future maneuvers. Black brings the bishop to d4, placing it on a strong central diagonal and targeting white's rook and pawn structure. This bishop becomes a powerful piece, exerting pressure on multiple fronts. White moves the rook to a3, a somewhat passive move aiming to defend the third rank and prepare for lateral defense or attack. However, it doesn't challenge black's active bishop or queen effectively. Black doubles down with rook hg8, bringing the rook to the open g-file and preparing to launch a kingside attack. This move is very thematic, using open files to increase pressure on white's king. White responds with rook g1. This move aims to contest the g-file but misses a stronger alternative, queen f3. Queen f3 would have coordinated the queen and rook to challenge black's pressure more effectively and maintain better control over critical squares. This is a common mistake in such positions, focusing on immediate defense without improving piece coordination. Always ask yourself, are my pieces working together or just reacting? Black captures on e3 with bishop takes e3, winning a knight and opening lines toward white's king. This is a powerful tactical blow that increases black's material advantage and attacking chances. White recaptures with f takes e3, but this opens the f-file and weakens white's pawn structure around the king. This structural damage will be important in the endgame and in defending against black's attack. Black grabs the pawn on h3 with queen takes h3, threatening to infiltrate white's position and increasing material advantage. This move also creates direct mating threats and forces white into a defensive posture. White moves the king to d2, trying to escape threats and connect the rooks. However, the king is still vulnerable in the center, and this move doesn't solve the underlying problems of piece coordination and pawn weaknesses. Black plays rook takes g2 check, a crushing check that forces white's rook to capture back and opens the g-file for black's queen and rook to dominate. This is a decisive tactical strike that capitalizes on white's weakened king position. White captures the rook with rook takes g2, forced by check but now severely exposed. White's king safety is compromised, and black's attack is overwhelming. Black finishes with queen takes g2 check, capturing the rook and delivering check. This move seals black's dominance with material advantage and a winning attack. White's position is collapsing, and resignation is inevitable. White plays king c3, stepping the king up the board. This is a natural attempt to centralize the king in the endgame, aiming to support pawns and activate the king. However, here black is already ahead by about 2 pawns, so white's king move, while logical, doesn't change the evaluation much. Black pushes d5, advancing the pawn to challenge the center. This move is solid but actually misses a stronger continuation, queen f2, which would have put immediate pressure on white's position and increased black's advantage significantly. The key idea behind d5 is to open lines and create pawn tension, but queen f2 would have been more forcing and tactically challenging for white. White captures e takes d5, taking the pawn on d5. This is the expected response, trying to reduce black's central control. However, this exchange slightly eases black's pressure, as black's queen will recapture and maintain active piece play. Black recaptures with queen takes d5, centralizing the queen and keeping pressure on white's position. This queen move is very strong because it controls key squares and threatens to pick off weak pawns on the queenside. Black's queen is very active here, and this move helps maintain the material advantage. White plays a takes b5, capturing on b5. This is a natural attempt to gain material and open lines on the queenside, but it slightly weakens white's pawn structure and hands black the opportunity to recapture actively. Black captures with queen takes b5, taking back the pawn. Interestingly, engine analysis suggests that c takes b5 would have been a better move here. Why? Because c takes b5 would have maintained a stronger pawn structure and opened the c-file for black's rook, increasing pressure on white's queenside pawns. Instead, queen takes b5 is more passive and allows white some breathing room. White moves queen h1, repositioning the queen. This is a quiet move, likely aiming to defend or prepare counterplay, but it doesn't challenge black's active queen or improve white's position significantly. Black pushes e4, advancing the pawn to cramp white's position and gain space. This is a thematic pawn break in endgames, pushing pawns to restrict the opponent's pieces and create passed pawns. Here, it also opens lines for black's pieces to infiltrate. The evaluation evens out briefly, showing the move's solidity. White captures queen takes e4, taking the pawn. This is forced, but it opens the position further and allows black to increase pressure. White is still behind, but holding on. Black checks with queen e5 check, activating the queen with tempo. This forces white's queen to respond and lose time. The key idea here is to use checks to improve piece activity and restrict the opponent's options. White captures the queen with queen takes e5, simplifying the position. This exchange reduces black's attacking chances but also lessens white's defensive resources. Despite the queen trade, black remains ahead due to the extra pawn and better pawn structure. Black recaptures f takes e5, maintaining the material advantage and opening the f-file for rook activity. This move keeps black's position solid and ready for further infiltration. White plays rook a1, bringing the rook into play along the a-file. This is a logical attempt to activate the rook and contest open files, but it's a bit slow given black's initiative. Black responds with rook h8, placing the rook on the h-file. This is a very thematic move, using open files to pressure weaknesses and prepare pawn pushes. Black's rook is now poised to support advancing pawns on the kingside. White moves rook h1, contesting the h-file. This is a necessary defensive move, but it's somewhat passive and reactive, showing white's struggle to generate counterplay. Black plays rook h7, doubling rooks on the h-file and increasing pressure. This is a classic endgame technique, doubling rooks on open files to maximize control and create threats. White plays king d2, moving the king toward the center. However, engine analysis suggests rook h5 would have been a better move here, aiming to challenge black's rook and create counterplay on the kingside. The key idea is that in such positions, active rook play often trumps passive king maneuvers. Black pushes h5, advancing the pawn to support kingside pressure and prepare further pawn advances. This move strengthens black's attacking chances and restricts white's king movement. White plays king e2, moving the king closer to the center. This move is a mistake. Engine suggests rook h4 would have been stronger, aiming to challenge black's rook and create counter threats. The key takeaway here is that in endgames with active rook play, it's crucial to contest open files and not just shuffle the king around. Black pushes f5, advancing the pawn to support the h4 pawn and solidify the kingside structure. However, the engine notes that h4 would have been a stronger move, immediately fixing white's king in place and increasing pressure. This shows how subtle pawn moves can have a big impact on the position. White plays king f2, continuing to move the king forward. Again, rook h4 would have been better to challenge black's rook and create counterplay. This highlights a common mistake, focusing on king activity without coordinating other pieces. Black pushes h4, fixing the pawn structure and restricting white's king further. This is a strong strategic move, locking down key squares and preparing to advance pawns or infiltrate with rooks. White plays king g2, moving the king toward the kingside. This is a passive move and misses a stronger plan, d4, which would have challenged black's pawn structure and opened lines for white's rook. The lesson here is to look for pawn breaks that open lines and create counterplay. Black finishes with king b6, centralizing the king and preparing to support pawn advances on the queenside. This move also cuts off white's king from key squares, tightening black's grip on the position. With black's material advantage and active pieces, this seals the game. White plays rook f1, shifting the rook from h1 to f1. This is a natural move aiming to activate the rook along the f-file, potentially contesting black's pawn on f5 or preparing to challenge black's kingside control. However, black is already ahead by about one pawn, so white needs to be very precise here. Black responds with rook h5, moving the rook from h7 to h5. This move looks logical, aiming to support the pawn structure on the kingside and possibly prepare to invade white's position. But here, black misses a stronger continuation. Rook f7 would have been better. Why? Because rook f7 would have doubled rooks on the f-file, increasing pressure on white's weak pawns and limiting white's king mobility. Instead, rook h5 is a bit slower and allows white some breathing room. This teaches us the importance of doubling rooks on open or semi-open files to maximize pressure in endgames. White plays king h3, moving the king up to h3. This is a natural attempt to escape the kingside pressure and perhaps support pawn advances. However, it's a bit passive and doesn't challenge black's plan. White's king is somewhat boxed in, which will be a problem as black's pawns and rooks become more active. Black centralizes the king with king b5, moving from b6 to b5. This is a strong strategic idea. Activating the king in the endgame is crucial, especially when you have a material advantage. Black's king now supports pawn advances on the queenside and restricts white's king from infiltrating. White pushes c3, trying to solidify the center and prepare for pawn breaks. This move is logical but slightly slow. White needs to be more active to counter black's plan. Black pushes c5, advancing the pawn to challenge white's center. This is a good move, but engine analysis suggests that e4 would have been stronger here. Why? Because e4 would have immediately crunched white's pawn structure, opening lines for black's rook and king to invade. Instead, c5 is a bit slower and allows white to capture and simplify. This teaches us the importance of timely pawn breaks to open lines and create weaknesses in the opponent's camp. White captures b takes c5, taking the pawn on c5. This exchange balances material temporarily and opens the b-file. But white still faces pressure due to black's active king and rook. Black recaptures with king takes c5, bringing the king further into the center. This is textbook endgame play, using the king as an active piece to support pawns and control key squares. Black maintains the extra pawn advantage and a strong position. White plays rook a1, moving the rook from f1 to a1. This is an attempt to contest the a-file and activate the rook, but it's a bit slow given black's active king and pawns. Black moves king b6, stepping back to b6. This may seem passive, but it's a subtle move to control key squares and prepare pawn advances on the queenside. Black's king is well placed to support the a-pawn push. White plays rook a4, shifting the rook to a4. This move misses a critical opportunity. Rook b1 check would have been stronger. Why? Because rook b1 check would have forced black's king to move, potentially creating weaknesses or tactical chances for white. Instead, rook a4 is more passive and allows black to continue their plan unhindered. This position teaches us the importance of active checks and forcing moves in endgames to disrupt your opponent's coordination. Black pushes a5, advancing the pawn to support further queenside expansion. This is a thematic move, aiming to create a passed pawn or open lines for the rook. White pushes c4, trying to challenge black's pawn structure. However, this is a major mistake. Engine shows a drop of over 3 pawns in evaluation here. The better move was rook a1, retreating the rook to a more defensive and active position. Why is c4 so bad? Because it weakens white's pawn structure and allows black to open lines and infiltrate with the rook and king. This is a classic example of a premature pawn push that creates more weaknesses than strengths. The key takeaway: always evaluate if a pawn push creates weaknesses or opens lines for your opponent before committing. Black immediately punishes this with f4, pushing the pawn to f4 and opening the f-file. This move increases black's control and creates threats against white's king and pawns. White captures e takes f4, taking the pawn on f4. This is forced, but it opens the e-file and further weakens white's position. Black recaptures with e takes f4, maintaining the pressure and opening lines for the rook. Black's position is now dominant, with active pieces and better pawn structure. White plays c5 check, pushing the pawn with check. This is a desperate attempt to create counterplay, but it doesn't change the evaluation much. Black's king can easily respond, and white's weaknesses remain. Black captures with rook takes c5, taking the pawn on c5. This move increases black's material advantage to 2 pawns and simplifies the position further. The key idea here is to exchange pawns and pieces when ahead to convert the advantage. White captures king takes h4, taking the pawn on h4. This is a small consolation, but white remains in a losing position. Black plays rook c3, moving the rook to c3. However, engine analysis suggests that rook d5 would have been stronger, aiming to cut off white's king and support pawn advances. This shows that even in winning positions, finding the most active and restricting moves is important to avoid giving your opponent chances. White plays rook d4, moving the rook to d4. This is a logical attempt to challenge black's rook and create counterplay, but black's advantage remains decisive. Black moves king c5, centralizing the king again. The engine suggests rook b3 would have been better, aiming to pin white's rook and increase pressure. This highlights the importance of rook activity and coordination in endgames. White plays rook d8, moving the rook to d8. This is an attempt to create threats, but black's position is too strong. Black pushes a4, advancing the pawn to a4. This move misses a better option, rook b3, which would have been more active and threatening. Still, black's advantage is overwhelming, and white's position is collapsing. White plays king g4, inching the king closer to the center and trying to stay active. This is a natural attempt to regain some footing, but notice how black's extra pawn and active rook already put white on the back foot. Black pushes a3, advancing the pawn dangerously close to promotion. This is a textbook endgame strategy. When you have a passed pawn, you want to push it as far as possible while your pieces support it. Black's plan is clear: force white to deal with this pawn or lose material. White captures with king takes f4, taking black's pawn on f4. This move regains material but also pulls white's king away from the center and the critical promotion race on the queen side. It's a trade-off between material and positional activity. Black responds by pushing a2, now just one step away from queening. This puts immediate pressure on white to act quickly. The key idea here is that passed pawns in the endgame are often decisive, especially when supported by active pieces. White plays d4 check, giving a check. However, this move is a critical mistake that costs white dearly. The engine shows a massive evaluation swing here, dropping over 5 pawns in white's favor if white had instead played rook a8. Why is rook a8 better? Because it directly attacks the dangerous passed pawn on a2, trying to stop it from queening. The check with d4 check looks tempting because it forces black's king to move, but it doesn't address the immediate threat of the a-pawn. This is a classic example of a move that feels active but ignores the opponent's most dangerous asset. The key takeaway: always ask yourself, what is my opponent's biggest threat right now, before making a move. Black calmly moves the king to king c4, sidestepping the check and staying close to the center. The engine suggests king b4 would have been even stronger, keeping the king closer to white's rook and pawns. But king c4 is still solid. White finally plays rook a8, attacking the a-pawn. This is a good move but comes a bit late. The earlier missed chance to play this move cost white significant ground. Black responds with rook c2, activating the rook along the second rank. This move supports the pawn and prepares to cut off white's king or rook from stopping the pawn. It's a strong, multi-purpose move in the endgame. White moves the king forward with king e5. This is a critical moment where white again misses a better alternative. King e4 would have been more precise. Why? Because king e4 keeps the king closer to the center and the pawn race, helping to block black's king and rook infiltration. By playing king e5, white steps into a more vulnerable position, allowing black to increase pressure. This position teaches us the importance of king placement in endgames. Centralization and proximity to key squares often decide the outcome. Black checks with rook e2 check, forcing white's king to react. This is a natural move to keep white's king restricted and maintain control over critical squares. White retreats the king to king f4, trying to stay active and avoid losing ground. However, the position is already slipping away. Black captures the pawn on d4 with king takes d4. This is a strong move, increasing black's material advantage and improving king activity. The king is now perfectly placed to support the passed a-pawn and control the center. White plays king f3, moving the king closer to the center but still struggling to find counterplay. Black's advantage is now overwhelming. Black shifts the rook to rook h2, eyeing potential infiltration along the second rank and preparing to support the pawn push or attack white's king position. This move increases black's dominance on the board. White moves king g3, trying to stay close to the rook and pawns, but this is more defensive than active. White is now on the back foot, reacting to black's threats. Black returns the rook to rook c2, maintaining pressure and controlling key squares. This flexibility in rook placement is a hallmark of strong endgame technique. Black keeps options open while restricting white's king. White repeats with king f3, unable to improve the position or create threats. This repetition signals white's lack of good options. Black advances the king to king c3, moving closer to white's rook and pawns, tightening the noose. This is a textbook example of king activity in the endgame. Black's king is dominant and supports the passed pawn. White checks with rook a3 check, trying to disrupt black's king position. While it looks active, it doesn't change the evaluation significantly. Black's king can easily sidestep and maintain control. Black calmly steps to king b2, moving out of check and staying close to the a-pawn. This move keeps the promotion threat alive and shows excellent king maneuvering. White captures the pawn with rook takes a2 check, giving check and removing the dangerous passed pawn. However, this is a missed opportunity. Rook a6 would have been better. Why? Because rook a6 keeps the rook active and ready to harass black's king and pawns, potentially prolonging resistance. By capturing the pawn, white loses the rook shortly after, which is a decisive material loss. This teaches us that sometimes it's better to keep pieces active and create threats rather than grabbing material that leads to losing your most valuable piece. Black captures back with king takes a2, winning the rook and securing a decisive material advantage. At this point, white's position is hopeless, and resignation is the natural conclusion. Before we wrap up, a quick reminder to subscribe to OngoleBull's Chess Journey channel if you haven't already. It's a great way to stay updated with more exciting games and deep analysis like this. To wrap this up, the key lessons from this endgame phase are: thanks so much for sticking with me through this analysis. Remember, endgames are all about precision and patience. Keep practicing these ideas, and you'll see your results improve dramatically. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like and subscribe to OngoleBull's Chess Journey channel for more fun and instructive chess content. And one last time, make sure to subscribe to OngoleBull's Chess Journey channel to not miss out on future exciting content. Until next time, keep those kings active and those pawns rolling. Happy chessing!